Let me explain what I mean by suggesting a different formulation of another 3 R's: respect, rights, and responsibilities. Firstly then, respect. Education and formation of the masses must enrich the intellect, cultivate virtues and good tendencies, and engender a spontaneous uprightness of the will, shape instincts and conscience, and steer us towards respect for one another, especially respect for divergent beliefs and diversities, principles I know which will be familiar to any Singaporean. I was struck by and agree with something which Chiam See Tong said while he was a member of the Singapore Parliament. The most important thing is that you have to respect an individual, whether he's got 6 C's or 6 A's, and whether he's a brain surgeon or a dustman. I think we should give him the same respect. If you don't give respect to your own citizens, I think you condemn them forever. But does respect trump all other considerations? In 1644, John Milton, in the Areopagitica, wrote, "Give me the liberty to know, to utter and to argue freely according to conscience." Nothing there about respect. It implies you can trample on anybody else in order to put your point of view, free speech. And the right to argue according to conscience is, of course, something greatly prized. People have died for the right to free speech. But I would argue that no right, including this one, can exist in a vacuum, and without a suitable respect for another person's belief and culture, we endanger the balance that has to be struck in any society. All freedoms must be tempered by mutual respect, which is why the ridiculing, for instance, of deeply held religious beliefs is itself disrespectful, and as we witnessed in Paris, invariably becomes inflammatory and can become offensive. Whipping up hatred against minorities or against people who are simply different from you will inevitably disrupt the harmony and good order of society. Equally, imprisoning a young man, for instance, as happened in Indonesia, for expressing on Facebook that he doesn't believe in God is wholly disproportionate and also disrupts the balance. If we are to be truly responsible citizens, then whatever our outlook, our beliefs, our profession or job, at all costs we must avoid a clash of blind fundamentalism, which Matthew Arnold, again, but in his poem Dover Beach, described as a place where ignorant armies clash by night. Respect, then, is needed by all of us, of other people standing in other persons' shoes. Understanding the position from where they are coming from is crucial. All of which underlines why to avoid ignorance and to ensure that our consciences are formed in a manner which enables us to make prudential judgments, we need appropriate forms of education. At the heart of what we teach must be a respect for others and for law and the placing of fetters on the unbounded autonomy of the individual, what Edmund Burke described as order that keeps things fast in their place. And this must be a part of the formation of every citizen. Educating for citizenship, then, will cultivate respect for what I like to call the dignity of difference. The dignity of difference. But can this be done in the schoolroom or university lecture or theatre alone? No. As Professor Singh said, I've travelled in various parts of the world. I've been privileged to travel in many parts of Africa. And there's an old African proverb, to educate a child, you need the whole tribe. It needs everyone, including our educational institutions, the family, religious and secular leaders. Everyone is born into a network of relationships, beginning with the family, and this is a partnership which must be spread across generations. The Zulu concept of Ubuntu, which is sometimes translated as humanity towards others. I think I get it right when I say Ubuntu, Ngumbuntu, Ngumbantu, a person is a person because of other people. That should inform the sort of questions which the whole tribe should be asking itself about what it stands for, and whether it is striking the right balance. What sort of things should we be asking of ourselves? Do we respect one another? Do we respect our parents and families? Do we respect our civic institutions? Do we respect those who are different, perhaps for reasons of race, religion, class, gender, or orientation? How do we ensure that vulnerable groups are not made more vulnerable or stigmatized, engendering respect for people with disabilities or the elderly? Do we respect the finite resources entrusted to us? Do we use them in a sustainable way? Do we respect our environment, from the streets and neighborhoods where we live to respect for the natural world? Do we actually bother to ask what creates respectful and good communities? Do we understand the importance of respectful relationships in sustaining society? And do we ask how we can strengthen the local and unleash the power of creative citizenship? How we can use the markets and our economies to reorder priorities, to reduce the sense of alienation, to encourage mutual respect? Are we going to turn our fire on the weapons of mass consumption, our addiction to hedonism, materialism, affluent barbarism? It was the Jewish sage Hillel who said rightly, "If I'm not for myself, who will be? But if I'm only for myself, what am I?" Or as Dr. Set E. said in 2011, life is not just about shoes and mobile phones. Are we only for ourselves, just for our possessions? Or are we educated to ask ourselves how we'll use our gifts, our wealth, our time, in an outpouring for the common good? You saw an example of that at the outset of our proceedings this evening. Philanthropy in action, pouring out something back into the community for the common good. Do we appreciate the privileges and the liberties which we enjoy? Do we create a tolerant, inclusive, and respectful civil society? It was Edmund Burke who once observed, "It's easy to give power, but difficult to give wisdom." How then can we achieve a civic education which helps to cultivate wisdom and virtue? How can it help strike an appropriate balance between respecting others whilst seeking to uphold our own rights? And what about then our rights, my second R? Well, in modern politics, the language of rights and choice has become a mantra. In his book, After Virtue, which I highly recommend, by Alistair McIntyre, it demolishes the idea that rights themselves can replace the richer language of personal and civic values. Civil society has become uncivil as modern citizenship has been perceived in terms of rights alone. An exaggerated emphasis on rights shorn of duties breaks a delicate balance and creates a chronically disordered society. John Stuart Mill saw rights as a scaffold erected by society on which we can hang the things which permit human and societal development. The contrary view of rights is that they are not created by law, that they exist for themselves, and that the law simply places them on a legal footing. This argument, of course, can be circular, and rather than arguing about the origins of rights, I think we'd be better served by simply identifying the rights which best serve us and which best serve the common good. So, in educating for citizenship, I would frame the debate about rights in the context of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which of course had its origins in the experiences of the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. It was born in Bergen-Belsen, it was born in Auschwitz, and it was born out of the atrocities committed here in the East at the hands of many of the allies of the Nazis. During the Second World War, the Allies adopted 4 basic war aims: freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion. Article 18 of this Universal Declaration, which upholds the right to believe or to change your belief or to have no belief, is honoured in its breach, contemptuously, I think, in many parts of the world, which is why I describe it in a report I helped to write last year as an orphaned right. And it desperately needs to be upheld in areas of conflict the world over. Think of the situation in Syria and Iraq, or in the Yemen, even while we're meeting here today, and you'll see the truth of that. The 1948 Declaration was the first global expression of rights to which every human being is entitled. 30 articles that adumbrate the right to life and rights of conscience, freedom of speech, religious liberty, and many others. Many of the articles have subsequently been incorporated in international treaties, national constitutions, and many diverse legal instruments, and form the bedrock of organizations such as the Council of Europe or the Commonwealth. The Charter of the United Nations reaffirmed faith in fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of the human person. The Charter required its signatories to promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. Like civil society at a local level or at a national level, imperfect institutions like the United Nations will only ever be as good as their component parts because of countries like this. But all of them are indispensable to good order. One of the United Nations greatest Secretary Generals, Dag Hammarskjöld, said The UN wasn't founded to take mankind to paradise, but rather to save humanity from hell. Hammarskjöld understood the fine balance which must always be struck between the rights we cherish and our commensurate civil obligations as citizens. He argued that the health and strength of a community depends on every citizen's feeling of solidarity with other citizens and on their willingness, in the name of this solidarity, to shoulder their part of the burdens and responsibilities of the community. The same is, of course, true for humanity as a whole. Humanity as a whole, though, through the small platoons of civil society, starting with the families, must learn the art of shouldering their responsibilities all over again and in every generation. Whether we're talking about our duties to our family and our duties to our neighbours or our duty as nations, we need to teach and reassert that with every right comes a responsibility, a duty and an obligation. So to complete my 3 R's, in my civic 3 R's, respect and rights, let's turn and look at responsibilities. It was Aristotle, the founding father of democracy, who believed that the requirement for a good city, a good society, or a good person all stemmed from the belief that we are social animals, and therefore that we are interdependent. He said we are not solitary pieces in a game of checkers. We're not solitary pieces in a game of checkers. We are all part of this same game. It's for each of us to work out the responsibilities that this place on us as we try to discover what it means in the polis, another of Aristotle's words, to be fully human, and in deciding how we cultivate a common life together. But that's also where education and formation is so foundational. Do we teach citizens to balance claimed rights by embracing our responsibilities, our duties, our obligations to one another, or does the language of rights simply become a flaccid language? Do we teach for everyone to play their part, not to opt out? Another of the great figures from our classical history, it was Cicero in Rome in his work on duty, who said that the whole glory of virtue is in activity. So when I was hearing earlier on about the community service that many of the students here are involved in, I agree with that. I think you learn a practical wisdom simply by playing your part, by being involved in activity. Interestingly, though, community service in Britain is something that the courts dispense as a punishment. And it's a phrase I think has been misappropriated by the judicial system, and I regularly complain about it, because community service is a high calling, and it's wonderful that so many of you are doing in the community for others. But what was true for the Romans is also true for us, that by actively participating in voluntary organizations, in philanthropy, in charity and civil society, in the small platoons, we learn a practical wisdom, and so we become better and more virtuous people. When you raise money for a local hospice, yes, you're doing some good for the people in that hospice, but it does you some good too. In 2005, the formidable American academic Mary Ann Glendon coined the pithy phrase, "Traditions in Turmoil," as the title for her analysis of the jettisoning of the ties which bind and the abandonment of responsibilities and duties. Consider for a moment the consequence of discarding values and virtues once taught by parents and reinforced by educationalists and by civil society, and simply replacing them with that flaccid language of rights and entitlements. She would argue, as I do, that if we were to educate for citizenship, we need a richer language, a language which comes with the privilege of sharing in the common life of a nation or community. Educating for citizenship is educating us to know ourselves. Now let me give an example. Singapore has always had strict laws, strongly enforced, against corruption, and rightly so, and that is to be admired. But beyond being told that corruption, stealing or lying is wrong, we also need to know what it is about them that makes them unacceptable. Rules must genuinely serve the development of judgment. As G.K. Chesterton once remarked, to have a right to do a thing is not at all the same as to be right in doing it, and we need the judgment to know the difference. Take the example now of science. All of us celebrate the extraordinary achievements of science, but we know that a scientist devoid of ethics, just like an entrepreneur devoid of a sense of responsibility to his employees, to the consumers or shareholders, can become a danger to us all. If I can paraphrase Albert Einstein, science that is devoid of ethics is lame. Equally, ethics or philosophy without an understanding of science is blind. Science, then, just like commerce, must be guided by a civic sense of working for all, not just for oneself. Einstein asserted that misuse of science could only be countered by those who are thoroughly imbued with the aspiration towards truth and understanding. I cannot conceive of a genuine scientist without that profound faith. So we need to cultivate curiosity of mind to understand why things are right, why things are wrong. Right and left are interesting in political terms. Right and wrong are perhaps more important in the way that we develop ourselves or develop society. It's a sobering thought, friends, isn't it? But more than half of the participants at Hitler's 1942 Wannsee Conference, which planned what was called the final solution to the Jewish question, that is, the extermination and murder of Europe's Jewish people, were either medical practitioners or in receipt of other academic doctorates. Nazi collaborators included a cast of scientists, doctors, judges, lawyers, philosophers, and academics. We need to ask ourselves the question, would we have been among them? So easy to drift along, it's so easy to go along, especially when your family is perhaps threatened or your potential in making progress in your academic career is impaired. It's very easy to be corrupted. So, manifestly, science operating in an ethical void, commerce operating in an ethical void, carries huge risks for society. H.G. Wells understood what would happen if we failed to appreciate the role of education in fostering a civilized society where personal civic responsibility is cultivated in every person, insisting that maintaining civilization is a constant race between education and catastrophe. To avoid catastrophe, then, we must educate, and always educate for virtue, for virtuous citizenship. And that principle must be applied across the piece, always encouraging us to ask the right questions about what we're doing and our motive for doing it. Making money and enjoying it, for instance, is clearly not in itself wrong, but has it become an end in itself? The civic education would encourage us to consider the role of individual and corporate philanthropy, the duty to support the widow, the orphan, the disadvantaged. It would encourage us to develop and examine our conscience. It was Socrates who said that an unexamined life is not worth living. If we were to educate for citizenship, we would enshrine the responsibilities of each person to live peaceably, to participate in civil institutions and the processes of local and national government, to contribute to the resourcing of commonly beneficial institutions, to acquire knowledge and to encourage the pursuit of knowledge in children, to learn respect for the needs of others, to behave ethically, and to appreciate how legitimate rights have been acquired, and to cherish them, and to learn how to strike the right balances. We would cultivate a respect for customs, laws, and institutions which serve the common good and harmony of society. We'd cultivate a belief in the supreme importance of the rule of law. We'd share our stories and our shared histories and memorialize the lives which bequeathed our liberties. We were talking just before we began about the importance of history and the healing of history. We have to stand in each other's shoes. I was a spokesman on Irish affairs for many years. My mother was an immigrant from the west of Ireland. Her first language was Irish. My father had served in the British Army as a desert rat. The conflict between Britain and Ireland is something I've lived throughout my whole life. And I was a spokesman in Northern Ireland when the peace process began there. I've seen progress which I didn't imagine 20 years ago. I've seen it, though, because people started to be willing to heal history, to enter into each other's lives, to memorialize their stories. Understanding the situation on the Korean Peninsula, where I've traveled in North Korea 4 times. I chair the Parliamentary Committee on North Korea. To understand the issues both north and south, one has to understand the relationship with Japan and the events that occurred during the period of occupation. Healing history is true in so many situations. We would also cultivate a reverence for impulses and altruistic outpouring which can accompany the religious faith which animates billions of people throughout the world. But beyond these 3 R's of respect, rights and responsibilities, what more might we say, especially about educating for virtue? What are the origins of these ideas? Because clearly they're not unique to me or novel to me by no means. In the West, Aristotle's ancient virtues continue to inform the debate about how we educate for good ethics and good citizenship. And those words, crafted by Aristotle almost millennia ago, were justice, wisdom, temperance, courage, magnanimity, tolerance, munificence, prudence, and gentleness. These ideas, along with the Judeo-Christian ideals of faith, hope, and charity captured by Thomas Aquinas, continue to inform both religious and secular discourse. And here in the East, Aristotle's belief in the promotion of personal virtue sits well alongside the Confucian concept of ren, compassion or loving others. For Confucius, such concern for others is demonstrated through the practice of forms of the Golden Rule. What you don't wish for yourself, do not do to others. Since you yourself desire standing, then help others achieve it. Since you yourself desire success, then help others attain it. Like Christ, he teaches that such altruism can be accomplished only by those who have learned self-discipline. He also says, to put the world right in order, we must first put the nation in order. To put the nation in order, we must first put the family in order. To put the family in order, we must first cultivate our personal life. We must first set out our hearts right. We must put our hearts right. The heart of the human problem is the human heart. We have to put our heart right if we want to make change in the ways I've been describing. If we're to be educated as active citizens who want to serve the common good, we have to begin with ourselves. Mahatma Gandhi said, you must be the change you want to see in the world. We mustn't lecture other people, and that's someone standing on a podium lecturing a lot of people. We've got to live what we preach. We've got to walk the talk. So we've got to be the change that we want to see in the world. Equally, in many places, the Holy Quran makes it clear that everyone will be responsible for their own deeds and held accountable for what they did in an upright society, beginning with the individual. And the Buddha reminds us of the responsibilities each of us has as individuals to choose our words carefully, respect, and to recognize the effect that they have and our actions have on others and on wider society. Whatever words we utter should be chosen with care for people who will hear them and be influenced by them for good or ill. The Dasa Rajadharma sets out the basic framework of Buddhist ethics for those who govern. And those 10 words, let me pick them out quite quickly, are charity, morality, altruism, honesty, gentleness, self-control, non-anger, non-violence, forbearance, and uprightness. And of course, from a humanist perspective, such virtues were well represented by a man I've already referred to this evening, Nelson Mandela, who said, our human compassion binds us the one to the other, not in pity or patronizingly, but as human beings who've learned how to turn our common suffering into hope for the future. So the virtues on which these ideas are based are acquired by practice. They are internal qualifiers perfecting the interior persona and thus deeply affecting society as a whole. But they don't happen by accident. And so as I come towards the end, let me draw these thoughts about respect, rights and responsibilities together and reflect on what happens when we fail to educate for citizenship. If such indispensable civic virtues which united East and West are not passed from generation to generation, civic sinews will begin to deteriorate and to atrophy. Let me remind you of a few manifestations of our disaggregated and dysfunctional society in the West. During the height of the riots in 2011, it was sickening in Britain to see a bleeding boy attacked and robbed by those who first appeared to have come to his aid, or the 67-year-old killed because he tried to prevent arson, or the 11-year-old brought before the courts and convicted because, along with thousands of other looters, he exploited the breakdown of law and order. Beyond our shock and anger, though, we've also got to ask ourselves some deeper questions about the kind of society we, people like me, have created and the kind of society which we want it to be. If we don't attend to the root problems, far worse will visit us in the future. These same questions face all developed societies. But let me briefly conclude by pointing to some of the consequences for my own country, the United Kingdom, in failing to educate sufficiently for citizenship, failing to synthesize these 3 R's of respects, rights and responsibilities. I said our responsibilities begin with our children, and with our families. Britain is a country where family breakdown and the abandonment of children has led to 750,800 children having no contact with their fathers. In 2014, the Relationships Foundation estimated the economic cost of family breakdown, let alone the human consequences, to be around £46 billion. The human costs, of course, are incalculable. In 2014, there were 68,000 looked after children in care, 1 in 10 children severely neglected in childhood. In 2013, 934,000 youngsters aged 10 to 17 were convicted of a crime. And according to the Children's Society, 100,000 children run away from home every year, with 14,000 children calling Childline about suicide. Since it was founded in 1986, it's counselled more than 1 million children. More than 140,000 people try to commit suicide every year, many of them young people. Suicide accounts for 20% of all deaths among young people aged 15 to 24. Toxic loneliness leads to depression, despair, and worse. Last year, the Samaritans organisation answered 4.6 million calls from people in despair. That's 1 call every 7 seconds. Last year, more than 29 million antidepressants were dispensed, a 334% increase since 1985, and at a cost to our National Health Service of £338 million. The 21st century is fast becoming a century of toxic loneliness, and any number of computer terminals and virtual reality friends on social networking sites are no substitute for human commerce and human kindness. The levels of loneliness, despair, and depression are the backdrop against which we're living. In Britain, an estimated 1 million people who are elderly do not see a friend or a neighbour or a relative during the course of an average week. 7 million people are now living alone in Great Britain, entirely unprecedented in our history. 26% of households comprising just one. On present trends by 2016, 36% of all homes will be inhabited by a single person. Many families and communities face indebtedness on an unparalleled scale. Total personal debt in the UK has reached £1.43 trillion, not far short of the national debt of £1.47 trillion. Indebtedness on this scale is intergenerational theft, and it's unsustainable. It's also a reflection of our failure to educate for citizenship, both in terms of individual as well as collective responsibility. Now, to reverse these sorts of trends, it will involve more than a general election. One is impending in the UK. It will involve the renewal of our battered and compromised institutions and require us to reassess how we see ourselves as citizens and how we see our obligations and duties, our responsibilities as well as our rights. And that will need our practical actions as well as different ways of thinking. And although I'm an independent these days in the House of Lords, I was once involved in a political party. Mine wasn't the party of Margaret Thatcher, but let me quote her in support of what I've just said. She once observed, "We're not in politics to ignore people's worries, we're in politics to deal with them." Well, over 60 years ago, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, having described the fall of Singapore as the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history, would weep when he saw the destruction of the East End of London by Nazi bombardment. Given what I just described to you about the social ecology in the UK, perhaps we should shed a few tears ourselves. But Churchill also understood the importance of drawing a whole nation around a common cause. And it's been interesting for me in these last extraordinary 24 hours in Singapore to see a whole nation coming to pay respect, regardless of difference or outlook, or what the historians will evaluate in terms of this period, but coming together. All the great things, said Churchill, are simple, and many can be expressed in a single word: freedom, justice, honour, duty, mercy, hope. And they're all words which society needs today. Well, it's sometimes said that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, but the second best time is now. We can despair at the civic deficit, or we can do something about it, and civic education is the key. As to how we teach it, well, I'm with the American writer Mark Twain, who said that education is not the filling of a bucket, but the lighting of a fire. It's not the Gradgrind approach that I outlined earlier on. Let's not turn it merely into dry-as-dust studies of constitutions or bills of rights. Education for citizenship is not a spectator sport or the preserve of a few well-meaning academics or specialists. It is the concern of us all and should be experienced as well as taught. Citizenships, of the kind I promote in some 800 schools in the north of England from my university in Liverpool, service learning, community endeavour, they've all got their part to play, along with the systematic teaching, which, of course, is a sine qua non. And that should be done across many different subjects. It's not something you do in a separate class and talk about citizenship. It's something to be explored in English literature. It's something to be explored in history. Something to be explored in the sciences. Community endeavour also has its part to play. And we must always show what is expected of the citizen in a democratic society about the formation of what I call, it's on the awards that we present to young people, piece of bronze which shows the tree of life, and it bears the legend, men and women for others, not just for ourselves. When she was completing her tour of duty in London, a former Chinese ambassador, Madame Fu Ying, told me that one of the memories she would take back to Beijing and that she would always treasure was about a boy called Isaac. I've given you a bit of the negative side. Here's a lovely positive story. After one of the natural catastrophes that had occurred in China, the earthquake disaster in Sichuan, Isaac walked from his home in Wales all the way to London. Why did he do that? He did it as a sponsored walk to raise money for the disaster victims. The ambassador said, an ambassador will never forget that. She said it was an example of a young man who'd been educated in what it truly means to be a citizen. That is a story from a modern Chinese diplomat. But let me now end with a story from ancient China about a man called Bian, and it's a story which some of you will be familiar with. One day, Bian found a large stone. It was actually an unpolished piece of the precious and highly valued stone jade. Bian was so excited by his discovery that he resolved to present the unpolished stone as a gift to the Emperor of China. Unfortunately for Bian, when he received it, the Emperor saw nothing except a large stone with its rough and disfigured surfaces. Believing that Bian was trying to make a fool of him, the Emperor angrily ordered Bian's left foot to be amputated. That Emperor died, and Bian tried again, presenting the large stone to the new Emperor. Once again, the potentate reacted angrily, and seeing only the exterior of the unpolished stone, he ordered that Bian's right foot should also be amputated. Now a third emperor ascended the throne. The cruelly mutilated Bian asked to be brought to the palace, and for 3 days and nights he lay outside, clenching the jade in his arms. The new emperor was exasperated but also intrigued, and he sent one of his courtiers to investigate, and then ordered that the stone be polished to see what it concealed. This was when they discovered a stunning and beautiful jade hidden beneath the rough and ugly exterior. Well, a failure to cultivate what I've called the 3 R's of respect, rights and responsibilities will also disfigure society like Bian was disfigured. By contrast, if we commit ourselves to educate for citizenship, we too will be rewarded by discovering the beautiful jade which was concealed beneath. We simply have to commit ourselves in wonderful institutions like this to do it. Thank you for being so patient and for listening so well.